an epistemic theory of information, and I'm here to attack the orthodoxy that information is physical. Here's the outline. I will first start with intentionality. Paul Grice's distinction of speaker meaning and natural meaning. And of course, if we are to talk about physical information, then we will be focusing on natural meaning. And then I will see what Fred Dresky would say about information using the relation of indication. And then I'll go to Ruth Millikan's teleosemantics, especially a problem of misrepresentation, to point out what it is to represent something in a naturalistic ontology. And then I will use my theory that I developed in my MPhil thesis to talk about what it is to interpret a signal, a text, or even our experience. And then I will use a design theorist, a creationist that argues for design in biology, DNA, and point out what I think is an orthodox confusion of information with something physical. So I'll start with Paul Grice's notion of intentionality. Well, he doesn't directly attack that problem, but meaning. It's a very early paper that's collected in this book. He talks about speaker meaning. So in ordinary language, the word mean, M-E-A-N, English, has various uses. So various uses, and one use is in the following. So when Peter asked for something, Paul shook his head. So Mary would report Paul meant rejection with his shaking head. So that's speaker meaning. Someone, a person, means a certain thing in contrast to natural meaning. Of course, for me, I don't think that's really meaning, but let's stick to what Grice pointed out. In ordinary language, we would say things like, so now the sky's cloudy. The sky's cloudiness means it's gonna rain soon, right? So people say these things, and the 38 tree rings means the tree is 38 years of age. Of course, maybe people would also say that, well, the cloudiness indicates that it's going to rain, but I agree that it's a linguistic, a pragmatic data that we do use the word mean in these ways. So now I go to Fred Dresky. His 1981 book, Knowledge and the Flow of Information. He uses Claude Shannon's theory of information, how information is measured using probability theory. He uses that to motivate an internalist conception of information and amount of information. And I will rephrase his theory, his indicator semantics in the following way. So conditional. Conditionals, sometimes we might encounter conditionals that are, well, we're not sure whether it's true, and we might assign a probability to its truth. So given that the seasons are still sharp, I mean, there are changes, seasonal changes over a year, that global warming isn't that bad yet. So if the tree had 38 rings, then it is 38 years of age because it has go around a year for 38 times, and that's how its bark develops the way it did because of the seasonal changes. So the 38 tree rings indicate 100% that it is 30 years of age. So the conditional probability among all possible situations that's relevant, among all relevant alternatives, if the tree has that many rings, then it is 38 years of age. In all possible situations in which it has that number, it has that year. So when it is 100%, it's easy. Of course, there are times at which the background condition is different, or maybe it's not only different, it's unknown, right? So this will complicate the issue, and that's where information theory comes in. And of course, we can also think about conditional in, well, the first conditional is an indicative conditional, and then we can also talk about subjunctive conditional. And were the tree to have 39 rings, it would have been 39 years of age. Of course, this also holds fixed the background condition if we were to use subjunctive conditionals, and that's how that's one way to think about information for Dresky in terms of indication. And of course, that's an information internalism, because when you look at the photo that's on the cover of the book, it wouldn't have encoded more information without increasing the resolution without any changes for internal to the photo. If it's held fixed for Dresky, there's no change in information. But of course, given semantic externalism, if they, let's say a Putnam version of semantic externalism, if the photo were caused by something else, even if it's internally the same, it could have encoded information about something else, but that's another issue. So indication, that seems to be something very simple, but if we were to think about misrepresentation, because indication, well, it's it's in an ideal situation that the tree rings will indicate the tree age, but then what about when it doesn't, right? Ruth Millikan, in her book, she develops, well, and especially in her later work, teleosemantics, she talks about teleology, because if we were to reduce or maybe even explain meaning, semantics, intentionality naturalistically, one way to go is using biological function teleology. So, but then let's use an example from artifacts, a car. The proper function of an oil pressure gauge, well, is to measure how much oil is in the tank. But then there's the issue of whether the measuring device is embedded correctly in the environment, and what it is to be embedded correctly. And one way in which, when the indicator, when it measures 0 without the oil tank being empty, well, one situation in which that happens is when the measuring device is not embedded within the normal range, when it doesn't relate to the modules of the car, other modules of the car, doesn't relate in the way that's normal, or when it can properly function. So that would be when it's a case of misrepresentation, but at least when it points to 0, that what we see on the dashboard, it represents, or it means, or that the tank is empty, but it's misrepresentation. So instead of focusing only on the good case, the ideal case, using teleology, and when it doesn't function properly, when it's not embedded in the environment correctly, we can talk about misrepresentation. And this motivates an externalism, because now the measuring device, how it relates to the environment, makes a difference to what exactly it is doing. So interpretation, this is my MPhil thesis. And I will stick with the dashboard case. So the signal, it's the pointer, what indicator of the on the dashboard, and there's a way to decode the signal, and how it is to decode it. It depends on how the encoding works, right? On the internet, when when some information is encoded, we use some algorithm, and to decode the encrypted information, we need to have the key or the algorithm to go back to the original information before it was encrypted. So the algorithm is something like a design, right? So the oil pressure gauge is designed to track the amount of oil in the tank. So given the signal and given the design, we will decode the signal in the way that it's the measuring device is designed. So in virtue of decoding the signal, we have the evidence of some fact, but that fact underdetermines the information, because let's say the measuring device, there's the issue of how sensitive it is, right? Because if a very slight change might not have made a difference to the signal, then change in physical facts does not make a difference to the change in information. Therefore, information doesn't covary with the physical fact. The physical fact constitute information, but it's distinct from information. And this point, I would like to further clarify using, I think, a confusion by Stephen Meyer. I think his argument is very articulate. He uses many examples from biology. It's worth looking into his work. But I think there's a fundamental flaw. And of course, the argument he makes is that, well, given all this, the relation between life and phenotype and genotype, he gives a lot of arguments, but at least in summary, he thinks that it indicates that there's an intelligence behind life, and he thinks that without that competence, there would not have been life. So life indicates that there's an intelligent designer. So intelligent design, God, creationism. So that's his argument for theism or even Christianity. But I would hold back there, because I think there's a difference between, of course, I've talked about a physical constitution of information, but there could also be a physical constitution from the past. So how many years a tree has been alive, the past would have constituted a present in which it has certain number of tree rings. But that's different from the number of tree rings constituting some information, because the fact could have been there without anyone processing some corresponding information. So there's fact, there's information, and there's the evidence. I think these things are they are related very closely, but the fact constitute information and information constitute evidence. But I think we should not confuse the following two things. We are to understand nature. So to understand nature, one way is to understand how the tree rings comes about. Well, because of the seasonal changes, because the bark, the thickness of the bark over the different seasons, when it's cold or when it's warm or when it's hot. And that's how we understand nature. There's no semantic processing from fact to signal. There's no this thing. There's nothing like that. Because decoding the signal, we have to know something like the algorithm, the design, or the semantics, if it's a natural language, right? But when we are to understand nature, we don't do that. It's a relation that's physical. It's could be causal if it's across time. It could be constitutional when H2O constitutes water. So an understanding of fact and the understanding of something like semantics, a semantic understanding and some other kind of understanding. I think we should be careful and distinguish these two things. So that's my take on how information is not physical. And I started with intentionality from Paul Grice, and then go to Fred Dresky on indication, Millikan representation, especially when we don't ignore the cases of misrepresentation. And I lay out my theory of interpretation. Of course, there are right interpretation and wrong ones. Of course, when we interpret a text, we could be not as, at least we're not off the mark. That would be when it's wrong. But a good interpretation would be it's within range. So, and given that a distinction between interpreting a text, a signal, or even an experience, I contrast my theory with what I think is a confusion of the semantic with the physical. Thank you very much.